When a GM creates an encounter in Dungeons and Dragons, there are a host of elements that they need to consider. Some are story related. Why do the characters run into these creatures or NPCs? What are they doing there? Do they live there? Were they just wandering by? What are their desires and motivations? Other elements that go into encounter design are more around the mechanics of the game itself. How many creatures are there? What is the terrain like? What is the situation vis-a-vis the players and the creatures when they encounter them? And, perhaps the most important, what are the creatures' stats? What are their combat abilities as opposed to those of the player character? And this mechanical balance in terms of D&D has been formulated in the manuals in terms of challenge rating, with encounters ranging from easy all the way up to deadly. But it's also game experience that will tell you, creating an encounter, whether this is going to be easy or deadly for the group you're running with. The mechanics of the game dictate, how many hit points you can take, the damage you can wield, etc. But the storyline is, players move through your world, they gain in experience, they gain in knowledge. The only thing that's going to end their storyline is death. Hello folks, KR King here, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaign. So as I've said earlier in the series, I've been playing D&D since the box set from the 70s, and often when I'm talking to younger players, especially now that I've been playing online, they often ask, were those days, in the early days, they were super deadly, they were, cutthroat players dropping dead all the time. And it's true that characters were much easier to roll up in those days. It didn't take you half a session to introduce a new character. We had deadly monster after deadly monster in these mega dungeons. And the random monster charts, you could get a lich, on the chart. So certainly it was very deadly. But like most recollections of the past, it's a little bit skewed because it doesn't really take into account the sort of philosophical considerations we had in terms of role-playing the game that made our relationship to killing things a lot different. And the best example I can give you is when you talk about the total party kill, TPK. And I hear younger players that with you, they've had direct experience with this, or they've heard about it in other games, and they'll say to me, they assume that, in fact, in my, the 70s, 80s, we just had total party kills all the time. And my answer is that in the 45 years that I have been a GM in Dungeons & Dragons, I have never killed off every member of a party. I have seen it done, but I've never done it. I've killed plenty of players, I've petrified them, I've disintegrated them, sent them to some primordial plane, never to be seen again. I've had parties defeated by every kind of monster there is, but I've never felt the need to kill them all. And the reason for this is whatever the mechanics of an encounter may tell you in terms of the game and die rolling, it is one of the worst storytelling decisions you can make to kill off an entire party. It's bad for the story of your world, it's bad for the party, it's bad for the players. And if you say, hey, I'm just trying to honor the mechanics of the game, I don't want to fudge rolls, I want to play things out as they should be played, I totally get that. And in fact, I respect that. But it's still bad storytelling. And I'll get pushback from players who say, oh, this is old-fashioned storytelling. Like Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, where as the reader, nothing bad is going to happen to Frodo and Sam. And in fact, he writes himself into a corner at the end with Mount Doom, where he has to have this deus ex machina ending in which the eagles come and rescue them. And in this view, the modern style of fantasy writing is like George R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones, where he kills off lead characters all the time because that's what happens. And I think he does this for two reasons. One is a literary reaction. He doesn't want to have that fantasy trope, the Tolkien sort of things. He wants it to be gritty, wants it to be realistic. And his inspirational text is a famous French historical series, The Accursed King, about France in the 14th century. Books that are filled with treachery and backstabbing, and the kings and queens and everyone below are just horrible people. And he has said this is kind of his inspiration for Westeros. So and I get all that, and if that's the kind of storytelling you want, that's fine. If that's the way you want to run your world, that's fine. But for me as a player, if I roll up Ned Stark and I run like 20, gaming sessions, and I get that character up to 8th or 10th level, and then you have me captured, and a little twerp like Joffrey chops off my head, and I'm dead. I'm not sure I want to run in your game. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean you can't make the players sweat things out. And there are situations in which, if an ancient red dragon breathes on a third level character, that character is dead. But in terms of the story of your world and the accepted game mechanics of how things are unfolding, why is an ancient red dragon breathing on a third level character? Or to look at it the other way, why is an ancient red dragon wasting her time with third level characters? So when you're designing encounters, you want them, in my opinion, to tend from hard, trending towards deadly. There's always a risk of a few players dying, and then you can modify things depending on their actions. If they think through a potentially deadly encounter, then it might turn into a hard encounter, or medium, maybe even easy. And if they act stupidly, let's say at third level they decide, let's go into the ancient red dragon's lair, it's going to go from deadly to what I call deadly plus. And those are the encounters that the players can get in big trouble. But you're thinking of both sides of this. If you have a hard encounter that turns medium or even easy, you've got a couple options. One is you just play it out. The characters, they kill off the monsters, they get a little bit of experience, but, they get a little bit of resource drain. But you can get a little more creative here. If this turns into a very easy encounter, you can have the creatures or NPCs, parley before the battle. They can surrender in the middle of the battle, or some of them can try to run away. This depends on the creature. Obviously, an ooze is not going to try to parley with the group before the battle or even during it, but it may try to flee. It may try to work through a crack or something if it gets down low in hit points. It's not necessarily going to fight to death. Most things want to survive. And the thing is, even though players want to get experience, they want to fight things and, advance in level, if you have too many easy encounters, just hack and slash and they always win, it can get boring. Especially for experienced players who've, fought tons of battles. The thing about creatures begging for mercy is they can be a source of information. And this is something we used to say in the olden days of D&D when it was, kill or be killed, was that not all things want to fight all the time. And what's an easy encounter for you is a deadly encounter for the opposition, and they may want to just surrender. But it's the deadly and the deadly plus encounters that are the most challenging for you as a GM in terms of the storylines of your world and, keeping the storylines of your player characters going. And these deadly plus encounters can occur for two reasons. The first, as I mentioned, the players just make dumb mistakes, or they just ignore every clue you're giving them and they just go into some deadly encounter, and there you have it. They're in big trouble. You can also have a deadly encounter that through circumstances or bad luck can turn deadly plus. The players are surprised, critical players blow some saving throws or whatever, and suddenly the balance between the player characters and the creatures or NPCs is out of whack, and you've got a deadly situation that turns desperate. Now, there's a couple of things that can happen here depending on your player character composition. I've been in some online games with players that don't know each other very well, or, they're just not sitting across a table. The situation gets a little out of hand and players just run away. They just use spells or whatever, and they just leave the scene. And they leave those players that are engaged, they're on their own. And whatever you think of those actions, the point is those left behind, this can be a death situation if they're fighting creatures that are going to eat them. And again, if you're determined not to fudge rolls, and I totally support that, you're going to have to play that straight up. But again, if you've set up a situation where things got out of hand, perhaps not for the player's fault, people have run off, or it's clear they're going to be defeated and eaten, you can use a little creativity here. Let them think of some inspired use of a cantrip, maybe inspiration. If you've got a cleric or whatever, praying to his god for one chance, there can be, something like a blinding flash of light comes and stuns the creatures for that moment. And the players decide, let's get the hell out of here or whatever. Now, if in that moment when the creature is stunned, if there's people on the ground that are out at this point, do the players go to rescue them, take that time? You may have players that go, screw that, I'm just getting the hell out of here, especially if half the group already ran away. And then players die. And make sure when you use this kind of inspiration, or you allow the players to be inspired in the cantrip, this is something they got themselves into. This isn't going to just happen every day. If they make stupid decisions, they're going to have to pay for those. Now, when you have more intelligent creatures in a deadly plus encounter, and whether some player characters have run away or they're all just obviously defeated, they can demand that the players surrender. And the surrender option is kind of a lost art in modern D&D that kind of mystifies me, because how often in fantasy literature have the protagonists been forced to surrender? They've been captured. The reason it happens is it's a great storyline. So let's say some players ran away and the remainder is ordered to surrender. Well, now you've got a split up party. Those that ran away have a task to try to rescue them, while from the inside, the players that have been captured are trying to escape. Again, this can be a little cumbersome running two groups, separately, but if that's what the situation, they got themselves into a deadly plus encounter, that's just how it has to work. And another thing is, even if the player characters insist on fighting to the death, they say, I'm not surrendering to these creatures, they're just going to kill me anyway, I'm going to fight it out. You can always have the creatures, once they're down to 0, stabilize them, tie them up, and take them prisoner, because the player characters might be worth more alive than dead to those that capture them. So then if the entire party is captured, they just work together to try to escape, or maybe their captors try to do a deal with them. That might be just something as simple as a straight ransom. You have to get us this amount of gold or we're going to kill you on this date. Or they could be asked to, complete some task to gain their freedom. And what this task is, or the ransom is, depends on the intelligence and sophistication of those that capture them. A tribe of orcs living in a cave complex are going to hold the prisoners in much less strict confines, and they're going to demand less than, say, some evil wizard in her tower. And of course, another element of being captured is the loss of treasure and magic items. So the players are being held somewhere without their treasure and items, and they're not even going to be ransomed. They're going to be sacrificed at the full moon to the hobgoblin gods. So they have a chance, obviously, to escape if they're all together, or to be rescued, work mutually, but they may not want to be able to take on the hobgoblin horde. They just need to get the heck out of there. Well, they've lost their treasure and items, but guess what? They were defeated. That's what happens. Now, the players may be highly motivated to return to the hobgoblin encampment to seek their revenge and get their items back, and that's just fine. The other element is, during that period of confinement, or when the player characters, let's say, that escaped are reconnoitering and trying to figure things out, the players can get information. You're going to find something out differently when you're in among the hobgoblins, right? You're there, you're listening to them. They may, have something in their cave complex that they don't realize is an item of power or something. And that information can be very useful, and it's created out of their loss. So in all of these variants, I'm perhaps killing some of the players, perhaps capturing all of them, perhaps the party splits up, but I'm not killing the entire party. And again, if the players get themselves into a deadly plus encounter, especially if it's their own fault, some of them are going to die, and some may die permanently. But I'm always thinking that if the encounter has gotten out of hand and become a deadly plus encounter, and it's not really the player's fault, use some creativity, think of something that can make this, adapted to your storyline. So having said all that, the thing is, when you're designing an encounter, you want to challenge your players, you want to put them on the edge, but you don't need it to have desperate edge of your seat, oh, we're all going to die every single time. So they're going to win most of the battles, but it's great to put that fear of death in them a little bit. When they see that every once in a while a player can die, they're careful, because that fear of death, that realization that, oh, this GM, they're playing for real here, that's what makes the victories sweeter. So in my next video, I'm going to design this, random encounter in the Barren Hills, and I'm going to use these techniques as I build this encounter up to think about, well, what happens if it turns easy and if it gets into a deadly or deadly plus situation. But until then, if you like what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments. I love to reply to them. And of course, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.